All right, welcome back everyone. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to use Jest to test a CLI tool that we've written in Node. If you don't know what Jest is, it's basically a test runner where you can write your unit tests and integration tests over your JavaScript files. Let's just kind of jump to it. So here I have a program with the main index file is how you run it, which is basically a sed tool. So you know what a sed is, it's a way to replace files or strings inside files with regex. So just to show you an example, if I run this program, so node source/index, it takes 3 arguments potentially. The first argument is the text file that you want to replace the internals with some regex. So I'm going to pass it that text file. And if I open that up, you'll see that it has hello world in it. And the second argument is the actual regex string that you want to replace. So let's say we wanted to replace hello with goodbye. I could say hello / goodbye and then /g. This is a global flag for the regex. So if I run this, notice that it prints out to the console goodbye world. Okay, the other option that you could pass into this simple command line tool is you can pass -i, which means basically overwrite the file in place. So if I run this, notice that this file will actually change to goodbye world. So a super simple tool. I mean, you could change the regex to replace whatever you want. But the main goal of this video is to show you how I would go about unit testing this little tool and how you go about integration testing this tool. Before I dive into it, let's look at the package JSON, and I just want to show you that we have one dependency, which is jest, and there are 2 commands here, test unit and test integration, where you can run test with a coverage port over a certain folder or a subset of folders and files. And we can use this later on as we're doing tests. But yeah, that's about it. So let me dive through the code and kind of show you what's going on, and then we're going to try to unit test this as well as we can, just to give you kind of an overview. So this is the index.js. This is like the entry point where basically when I call this in my terminal down here, it's calling this file. And this file does 2 things. It basically parses the arguments, which means is basically taking all of these and extracting the useful things and sending them back. So we have a nice like named variables we can use from the return object. And then down here we have a main where I pass those in. Now the main reason I separated those out is because let's say I didn't want to use the CLI tool and I want to do this on like a web API. I could just simply just use the same main function wherever I wanted to and not have to worry about like arguments and stuff like that. But that's for another topic. So let's dive into that main JS file. And this is where all the top level control happens. So basically, we load in the file that was provided with that file input path here. And then we process that file's text with the regex that we pass in here. And then, depending if that I flag is set or not, we either write back to the console log or we overwrite that file. So it's a very straightforward command line tool. And it's kind of composed of different smaller modules or units, which kind of makes it easier to unit test. That's one thing that you can start learning about unit testing is I could have written this all in one file, but it makes it a little bit more difficult to test efficiently when you don't really have small units and you just have a giant file that does everything. All right, so let's just quickly dive in. Basically, read file from disk is a wrapper around nodes fs. And the main reason I did this is just to kind of isolate or add a layer to any type of IO requests. And that just kind of helps testing as well. And then same with write file to disk down here. It just wraps fs write file here. In fact, I probably could probably refactor this like this. Instead of, I was kind of in the process of changing some stuff. So let me just run my integration tests and verify that this still works as we'd want it to. Actually, I don't have any integration tests. So anyway, I'm getting kind of off topic. So let's go back. And the other, like everyone knows what console log is, so this isn't really important. But this is the last method we can kind of look into. And this really just makes a regex and replaces the text and returns that text. So nothing too extravagant in this program. So let's actually dive into how do you unit test all of these different smaller units. So the easiest thing to test would probably be the slash delimiter regex replacer. So let's go ahead and make a new file here. And I'm going to append test.js to it instead of just JS. And this allows, this kind of denotes like it's a test file, right? So Jest can easily find your tests and run them. Otherwise, you can't really tell what a test is. Okay, so the first thing in Jest is basically all your tests are built up with describe blocks. So you have a describe block where you basically have a description of the unit that you're trying to test. So in this case, I'll just put the actual name of the method or file. And then you, inside of that describe callback, you put different it statements. Autocomplete's kind of annoying sometimes. So you have it statements that kind of describe what you plan to do inside of that unit test. So here, what I could pretty much do is look at what we're trying to test. So it's a method that takes in some text in a slash delimited string, and it should return the regex replace string. So let's just say a test is going to be should replace hello with goodbye when passed hello slash goodbye slash g. So the same kind of test that we did in the terminal down below, we're just going to unit test the single little method. So let me go ahead and split this so we can actually look at both of these side by side. Put the test on the right. Okay, so the left is the implementation and the right is the test that we're trying to write. So notice that this doesn't really have any dependencies, so we don't need to do any mocking or anything like that. But let's just try to first just test it with that simple use case. So in order to test this function, we are going to have to include it. So I'm going to require it at the top. Okay, so now we have the ability to call it. And let's just go ahead and call it with those arguments. So I'm going to say slash delimited string and text. So the text will be hello world. And your slash delimited string is going to be hello goodbye G. So let's get the output of that. So notice that the test, we are basically executing the code that we're trying to test. We get some output, and then the key thing of testing in general is you definitely want to expect something. So I'm going to expect the output to equal something else. So what does this function actually do? Well, it should run the regex and replace the text wherever we see hello, it should be replaced with goodbye. So I'm going to say should expect goodbye world. Now, if everything went according to plan, I can run that single file, so source slash delimited regex replacer test. If I run that with npx jest, we see that it does indeed pass, which is pretty cool. So now we know with certainty, or some certainty, that this functionality works as we want it to. And you could obviously test other things, like you could pass in a string that doesn't have this and expect that it throws an error or expects that it console logs something for you, because that would probably crash my program. But that is basically it. And one thing that's good to do when you're doing unit tests is you want to make sure that your test is actually verifying the code correctly. So what you can do in here is go in and change some type of implementation, rerun your test, and it should fail. If it doesn't fail, then you probably written a bad test. And this is what it looks like when it fails. So notice here it says expected goodbye world, which is basically saying this was expected to say goodbye world when we actually received hello world, right? So you know that there's something wrong with this implementation. If one of the developers came in and made a change that happened to break this functionality that you expect, you get that feedback really quick with a unit test. There's also a way in Jest to run like watchers, so as you're saving files, it can kind of rerun your tests and you can get that instant feedback. But since I'm running screen recording right now and Jest kind of uses a lot of CPU, it would just slow everything down. So yeah, that's basically a unit test for that one method, and you can kind of go further and further and write a bunch more tests, but just for the sake of this video, let's move on to some other logic here. So the next thing I want to test is let's test that write file to disk function here. So same idea, if we just make a new file, write file to disk.test.js, and what I like to do is just go ahead and copy and paste an existing test file. And we can modify this as we want. So let's close out of this. We got the test on the right, we got the implementation on the left, and let's go ahead and get to it. There we go. So this is a really, like, kind of a shallow method that doesn't really do anything. It really just passes through some arguments to fs write file sync. So you might not necessarily even need to unit test this. Like, you don't need to, like, if you have unit test coverage that's expected to be 100%, then yeah, you might have to test this function. But if it's a function that's so simple that you can just look at it and say, okay, this is passing in the right data, then you don't always really need to unit test it. Don't follow dogma and say that everything has to be tested. If it's simple enough, then you probably don't need to test it all the time. But anyway, let's just do it for the sake of this video. So one thing that's new to us is we are importing inside of our implementation a node package called fs. So what we want to do is we'd probably want to mock that out. So if you don't know how mocking works, basically a mock is like a fake implementation of some type of module or function so that it doesn't affect how your tests are running. So like, for example, this fs function, we're writing a unit test, so we don't want it to actually touch the disk because that's slow and it's prone to errors. And you want your unit tests to run really fast. So if you have a bunch of tests that are all writing and reading from disk, then your tests are going to be really slow and thus slow down your feedback loop. So let's go ahead and look at how to mock out this fs function. I'm just going to go ahead and just clear this out. And let me rewrite and describe. So should attempt to write to disk using fs.write file sync. So that is the test we're trying to write. We're trying to say that if we call this function, we should expect that it tried to invoke this, okay? So let's go ahead and call that. So I'm going to say await write file to disk. I'm going to pass it path and data. And this is going to just be fake data. It doesn't actually have to be a real path. So some fake path. And since we're using await, we need to put async here. And let's just keep track of the result and expect the result to equal ABC. That's what we're going to mock it out to return. So if we try to run this test right now, it's going to fail because it's going to actually try to read from my file system this file, which doesn't exist. So I can actually try to run this. Let's see, source write file to disk. And it should fail and throw an exception or something like that. So let's see. Yeah, there's no file in this directory. Okay, so the issue with this, again, is our unit test is trying to access the file system, which is not a good approach when you're doing unit testing. So what we want to do is mock out this function here. So in Jest, you have the ability to do that by simply importing the module that you want to mock out. So this is the module we want to mock out, fs. So I'm going to say const fs is equal to require fs. And then I want to spy on it. So I'm going to say spy on fs, and then more specifically, I want to spy on this function here. And what you can do is down here, you can change what happens when you call this method. So I'm going to say fs.writeFileSync.mock implementation. And what that is going to do instead is just return ABC. So this is another jest construct. So right now, this is a jest mock. Basically, this overrides that method with a mock. and you have the ability to kind of change what happens when the internal function calls write file sync. So in this case, I want a completely new implementation that just returns ABC, and that's it. And this will prevent this from actually reading the file system. So if I rerun this test, it should pass now. So it is passing. We got back ABC, and that is pretty awesome. And that is basically testing that if this were to actually read in some data, it does pass it back as a return value of this function. Another thing that you can do in jest, in mocks in general, is you can expect that certain things are passed in. So let's say we wanted to take this unit test further and expect that this function was called with a particular parameter or argument, in this case path and data. What we can do, you know what, write file sync. Yeah, what we can do is down here, we can expect that mock, so write file sync dot mock dot calls, get the first call and get the first argument. So this would be path. Argument 1 would be data, and argument 2 would be UTF-8. All we care about is path 0, and expect that to equal, I'll say, some fake path. So let me rerun that. And that should pass, hopefully. And it does. And just to verify that, let's say someone accidentally appended a slash to this or something. Would this pass or would this fail? And so it fails because we got this, but we expected this. Okay, so that was just kind of verifying that a unit test actually do what they're supposed to do. And you might say, okay, so when do you actually check like what you're passing in? Typically in a unit test, you want to test the inputs and outputs of your function. And this right here is testing the inputs and the outputs, basically. Unfortunately, you do have to kind of dive into your implementation and know what to mock out. But this is kind of verifying that your function calls and passes the correct data to external dependencies, which is important as well. But just note that whenever you mock and whenever you do stuff like this, your tests can become a little bit more brittle, which is not a good thing to have. You want to be able to refactor code and not have your tests fail, like not have every test fail. You might want to have some tests fail if you refactor. So just be careful if you're mocking out too much stuff and you're like expecting certain calls to happen. Anyway, okay, so let's just move on. Rerun this, make sure it passes. Let's move on to another test file, shall we? So I guess we could look at, let's see, read file from disk is basically the same thing. So honestly, I could probably just copy and paste this and just change some stuff. So read file from disk task. All right, so this does basically the same thing, but what we want to do is we want to mock out the read file from disk, and we want to import read file from disk, and we want to mock out write file sync. And that doesn't take data, and that mocks implementation. All right, so I went ahead and printed out what read file sync is, what the mock calls are, and it turns out it's an array of a bunch of different calls. So I'm guessing when you run jest, it's using fs read file sync to load in a ton of different like JavaScript files. So you can't just expect that the first call is this. So one thing that you could probably do is before you run your tests, actually, I'm not too sure, honestly. So I think you could probably just reset your jest mocks here if you wanted to. I'm trying to remember how you do that. Clear all mocks, I think. Jest.clear all mocks. So mock the implementation and then clear it. Let's see if that works. Okay. So that actually works. So I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but I mean, obviously Jest is using this method when it starts running tests. So if you mock it out, you're getting a ton of different calls to it, and the last one should be the call that you're expecting. So what you do is you just clear all your mocks before you run this, and you can actually check that certain things were passed to your FS read file sync. So anyway, kind of confusing there. Let's move on to argument parser. So this one should be a pretty easy one. If we just say argument parser.test, we can make that file. And what this one basically does is it should take in your regex string and then just return these arguments. So we want to verify that if you pass in certain strings, we do get back the expected arguments. So let's just write a describe argument parser. And let's do an it statement and say should return the expected object. You could probably name this better than what I did, but anyway, if you import this, so const argument parser is equal to require argument parser, we can then call it with some arguments. If you notice here, we have args, which needs to be our goodbye, or say hello, goodbye, and G. So we're basically testing that if we pass in that command line, like, regex, that we get back a certain type of object. So I'm going to say output to equal, or you can also say to match object. But I'm going to verify that all of these are set accordingly. So I'm going to actually args needs to be an array, I believe. So this actually needs to be that. And if so slash delimited string should be hello, goodbye, and G. I forgot the path. So yeah, we also need like a path here. So I'm going to say like test.txt or something. How about that? So if I were to pass this in, replace existing file. So remember that's the -i that we used earlier. That should be false. And this should be set to test.txt. So let's just run that one. Okay, so that passed. And it's good to test your different branches. So another branch would be is if I is passed in, we want to verify that this is set to true. So let's just go ahead and copy and paste this our it statement. So it should return, should set is replaced to true when -i is passed in. So that is the test that we're trying to verify. And -i was the third argument. So if I just pass in -i, we should get back to match object, an object that has is replace existing set to true. So if I run that file again, we should get 2 passing tests, I believe. And it's always good again to like verify this stuff. So someone came in here and accidentally changed that. Our test should verify that, hey, like this isn't setting this Boolean correctly. And it does. So again, as you're writing tests, it's always good to just go back and verify that if you break your actual implementation, your tests start failing as well. Or you could do test-driven development where you write your tests first and then you start coming in and implementing it. Yeah, so the last file that we haven't tested is this main file. And this file is a little bit more complicated than all the other ones because we're doing all these different calls to different methods. So we might need to mock out what happens when we do read file from disk and write file from disk. But all in all, we want to, let's see, let's just go ahead and try testing this. So I'm going to do main.test.js. Let's just go ahead and get that describe block going. And what we actually want to do here, split this. Is we are going to have to verify that if we were to pass in certain things, so let's just say should print to the console when is replace existing is false. Okay, so that is the one, we're kind of testing these two branches. We have an if statement here. It's good to test both branches. And we're going to test this console log first. So what we can do is call main, pass it some arguments. So this will be hello, goodbye, G, replace existing should be false. File input path will be test.txt. And we're using async here, so let's make sure we add that. Now, again, in order to verify that a console log was called, we're going to have to do some spies and some mockings. And so that we don't write to the actual file disk or read from the disk, we're going to have to mock some stuff out. So again, let's just go ahead and import those things. So I'm going to import write module, and that's going to be from write file from disk. And then we also have read module. And that is read file from disk. And what we want to do is you just want to spy on those things. So I'm going to say spy on write module, and we want to spy on the method write file to disk, and do this. And we also want to spy on the console. So console spy on log. And we're going to basically, we're going to have to mock out the implementation of these two. But the console log, we can just easily check down here. I haven't imported main yet, so let's just import main before I forget about it. Okay, so right now, if we were to run this, it's actually going to try to read and write from the file system because we haven't mocked it out. So if I do read module.read file from disk, and I say mock implementation, and just have that return hello world, that's basically mocking out as if like that test.txt file has content of hello world. Same idea with a write file to disk. If I mock this out and make it basically return nothing, then it shouldn't actually write to my disk. And finally, I think actually that's probably all we need to do. Now down here in the expect, what do we need to check again? Well, we just wanted to check that a console log was called. So I'm going to say expect console.log calls, console log mock calls first call the first argument to equal goodbye world. Okay, so basically we call this, and then we expect that console log was called with goodbye world. So now I should be able to run this test, and it should pass, I think. It failed. Let's see what it failed on. Just spy is not a function. That's because it's spy on. Let me just do spy on and try to rerun that. And require /main. So we expect a goodbye world, we got back hello world. So let's kind of dive into what's going on. So we are in fact getting a call to console log, right? So it's probably that okay, yeah. So one thing is when you're doing mocks, we might be calling a console log somewhere else maybe. So it's always good to, when you're after each or before each, to reset your mocks or clear all mocks. Let's try this. Just.clear all mock. And rerun that. I don't know if that's actually the issue here. Okay, so sometimes you get run into situations like this, and you're gonna have to actually start console logging some stuff. So if I go into my implementation and I print out the process text file, let's see what this is actually doing. It's probably printing out hello world still. Oops, give me parentheses. And it would help if we just print out some other stuff too, like file text. What is file text? What is our slash delimited string? All of these things are important to know to figure out what is going on. Okay, so we have hello world, we have hello slash goodbye slash G. Text file says hello world in it. So it seems like our slash delimited regex replacer isn't doing, oh my gosh, okay, because we came in here and we changed this to a hyphen, and I totally forgot to change it back because I did not rerun my test. Okay, that's what happens when you go too fast sometimes. Okay, so we got back goodbye world. It's failing because I forget that console log appends a new line character. And I'm also doing a ton of console logs. So let's get rid of all these console logs and just verify that we get back a goodbye world here. You know what? Maybe it's not the new line. Let's try this again. Okay. Whew. Passing now. Awesome. So that tested one branch. This is probably the most complicated file so far. So I tested one branch with the console log, and that is working. Now the other branch you want to test is should overwrite the existing file if is replace existing is true. So what we want to do here is we just want to check that that other spy that we have running is indeed called. So write file to disk. If this is true, so is replace existing is true, we should expect that this method is called with path and data. Okay, so to equal an object where input file path would be test.txt because that is the file that we've read in, and data should be goodbye world. So if we did this right, hopefully that should print out a passing test here. And it is. Okay. Cool. So we have basically all of our small units of code tested with unit tests. We could go further and do like exception testing and verify that certain things print out to the console if you don't pass in arguments. But this is just a basic overview. We saw some mocks, we saw some spies. We know how to clear mocks, how you write jest statements. Another thing I wanted to dive into is integration testing, and then I'm going to wrap this up. So it's good to have unit tests because they run really quick and they give you like feedback when you accidentally break something, but that doesn't truly test what happens if you were to run this in like a command line tool, right? So it's good to have integration tests that actually run this command and verify that it prints out what you want. So I'm just going to write one for the sake of this video, and it's going to be called standard in, or I'm sorry, it's going to be called console logging.test.js. So we can do basically the following. We'll again do a describe block, and I'm going to say running the CLI with expecting a console output, right? So, man, this is so annoying. How does that? Should print to the console the results. So this would be very similar to that last main test that we wrote, but the main difference is we're going to actually execute a shell script here. So I need to import child process. And I can execute some node command here. So I'm going to say node, I'm going to try to run that index file here. And then I'm going to run that integration slash fixture slash test.txt as my input file. And then again, hello slash goodbye slash G. So if I were to run this, we're going to get a callback here. So I'm going to say error, standard out, and standard error. And basically what our test needs to do is verify that standard out is equal to goodbye world. And since this is a test that has a callback in jest, you can pass done as an argument to your if statement here. And whenever you're done with all of your callbacks or promises, you can just invoke done and the test knows when it should be done. So let's try running this integration test and see if it works. All right, so what happens? It says standard out was not called. Expected to be called and it was not called. So let's just verify that if I were to run this like so, we do get a goodbye world. I think it adds a new line at the end of it. Could be wrong. Let's try doing that. Okay, yeah, that is the issue. Okay, so now we have an actual integration test that runs this command line tool, which in my opinion gives you more certainty that the tool actually works the way a user would run it. Now the main downfalls to integration tests is you could test all the different variations to like regex and flags and arguments, but it's going to be a lot slower because you're actually running like a separate node command, which takes more resources and time, versus a lot of this stuff could be verified in a unit test. So that is one reason why people argue that unit tests are really important to have the most of, and then integration tests should just verify that certain things are connected together. All right, well, that was kind of a quick overview. I was going pretty quick, made some mistakes. If I might make another video that's a little bit slower and kind of goes into more detail on testing, but hopefully this was enjoyable. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have any feedback or suggestions about videos like this or any ideas of videos I can make, be sure to leave a comment. And again, this is always posted to my YouTube channel. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Cody Seibert, and have a good day.